I feel so privileged today that you have made it this evening. And I welcome all of you to 2019 Tornos' Knowledge Evening. The idea of Knowledge Evening is to disseminate micro-destination knowledge and concentrate on a particular topic each year or a theme. This time we have chosen Cawnpore as our theme, which is a destination just about 2 hours, 100 kilometers from Lucknow, which is the capital of Uttar Pradesh. I'm so privileged to introduce you to our star speakers on the subject of Cawnpore today. We are honored to have with us Sir Mark Havelock-Allan, 5th Baronet of Lucknow, whose great-great-grandson of the hero of the Indian Mutiny, Major General Henry Havelock, and so the great-grandson of Lieutenant General Sir Henry Havelock, 1st Baronet, who was an equal hero in the Indian Mutiny and gracefully faced the mutiny both in Cawnpore and then in Lucknow. Havelock received the Victoria Cross for his role in the mutiny, and Sir Mark Havelock-Allan is a former barrister and a retired judge. Now he has researched his ancestry very well and is a master of this subject, especially his ancestors' Havelocks in India. And now he heads the British Association of Cemeteries in South Asia as its present president. We are also privileged to have with us Dr.Rosie Llewellyn-Jones, a celebrated historian, researcher and an author of innumerable books on India decorated with MBE. No research on British India is ever considered complete without referring to her works. Some of her published works are The Fatal Friendship, A Very Ingenious Man, Claude Martin, and Biography of Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, The Last King of India, which were critical success both in Britain and India. Then there is one of hers on the Indian Mutiny, the Great Uprising in India, 1857-58. But above all, she is my mentor since the inception of my company in 1994. And not only does she guide us, but helps us researching and developing many of our products and training the specialist guides that we recruit. We are very delighted to have both of you here with us this evening, and we look forward to the talk which will be the highlight of this evening. My company Tornos, with your blessing, celebrates its 25 years this year. And because it is based out of Lucknow, our intention always was and will always be to highlight our city, which is a deserving destination in India, but somehow undersold. From 20 foreign tourists in 1994 when we started, now we have moved to 20,000 in 25 years of our journey. But seeing its potential, it's only 25% of the appetite. So, now, the DMCs actually work a lot to give you information about destinations, but somehow destinations such as Lucknow, Cawnpore, or areas which are off the beaten track have limited reach when it comes to tour operators in different parts of the world. So that's the idea of this evening, to bridge that gap and get you the straight knowledge from the destination. We've divided this presentation in 3 parts. The first part is a brief about Lucknow as a destination. In our last knowledge evening last July, we had dealt with Lucknow in detail. So I've tried to shorten that presentation, including a bit about the products that we have in and around Lucknow. This presentation will be followed by the Story of Cawnpore by Dr.Rosie Llewellyn-Jones, and then finally it's about Havelock by none other than Sir Mark Havelock-Allan himself. So if you see that we belong to an erstwhile estate of Awadh, the Mughals were ruling the entire country, and for better administration they had divided their kingdom into different small parts, Awadh being one of them. Now, there's very interesting thing about the spellings in India, where with spellings the history changes. So if you say Awadh, it is the Mughal Awadh, the Nawabi Awadh. If you read it as Oudh, it becomes the British Awadh. And now, of course, it changed to later United Provinces during the Raj, and much later it became Uttar Pradesh, which it is now. One of the biggest and the most populous states of India, which decides the politics of India basically. So it is said that if you have won our state of Uttar Pradesh, you have won the seat in Delhi. So that's how important it always was, and it always will be. Now if you see this map, we will be discussing two more places. Lucknow being the capital, of course, and you have Kanpur and Bitur, which was already in the possession of British. So it was not a part of the Awadh kingdom of the Nawab. So much earlier it had gone straight into the British hands. Now for better administration, Mughals had appointed sort of governors to govern the province of Awadh, and these governors were brought from Persia because it was believed that Persians had a better sort of hold on administration. So these were the, and then later on, of course, they declared themselves independent with the help of British, and Awadh became a small kingdom in itself. The first capital of Awadh was Faizabad, which is about 2 hours drive from Lucknow, and then the capital was shifted by Nawab Asif-ud-Daulah in 1775, and this capital came to Lucknow, and Lucknow still is a capital of the state of Uttar Pradesh. You can come here, Sue. And the last, of course, being Wajid Ali Shah, who was deposed to Calcutta by the British in 1856. Architecturally, of course, a marvelous place. All the constructions, as a new capital takes shape, it takes form, all the constructions start happening. So, in the same manner, when the capital was shifted, a lot of construction happened. Some of them are really awesome, like this film is showing you parts of the Asifi Imambara, which is one of the biggest building without any pillar support and with no use of iron or wood in it. So these are architectural marvels of the city that took place. Then the most powerful of the monuments of Lucknow is the Lucknow Residency, which was again built by the Nawabs exclusively to have the British resident stay there. So it became a kind of a British colony of sort, where these Europeans stayed there. They had a small infirmary, a hospital, a treasury house, and it was a kind of a small walled city, you can say. They had a small shops, market, a small shopping area or something. So it was a kind of a walled city that came up in Lucknow, which is the British Residency. It was destroyed in the siege of 1857, and it was left as it was destructed and destroyed, which makes it the most powerful monument of the city today. Especially when you have the British tourists coming in, they would definitely like to spend good half a day in residency exploring the entire story of the 1857 mutiny. And I think Lucknow also happened to be a place where the maximum number of British died at one place. So there were about 2,000 odd British children, ladies. So not necessarily that they were soldiers who died, but these were common British who died in the residency. Then another place which is usually not on the itinerary because it is not a public monument or a public historical place which can be visited, which is Le Martiniere. Le Martiniere is now a school, had to be a palace which could never be used to live. A lot of research and a lot of books on Le Martiniere, a lot of work has been done by our next speaker, Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones. And in fact, her own research was based on Claude Martin, on Le Martiniere, when she came to Lucknow. And she's still in love with that place. This is one of the largest schools in terms of area. The total area at one point of time was bigger than the India's president's house in Delhi. It is still one of the biggest in terms of schools that one could find. A school which, it's a very rare honor for a school to have battle honors given to it for the defense of the British during the siege at the residency. So actually the boys and the masters participated in the Indian Mutiny of 1857 not exactly to with guns, etc., but to do very important things like running errands and taking care of the sick and all those things. So it has a very fabulous kind of a history. We also have William Hodson, who was another hero of the mutiny, buried in this estate. So that is another point of important point where guests covering the subject of Indian mutiny should be visiting the school. One of the most well-kept living monument, I would say, with a lot of stucco work in Wedgwood style and a very impressive building with lots of artifacts, arms, cannons, bells being kept there. Then of course Lucknow has two parts. There is a Cis Gomti area and there is a Trans Gomti area. So when it's Cis Gomti, it is old, world charm. When it is Trans Gomti, if you move a little further, it transforms into a modern city. So it's a combination of the two, coexisting. So there are these old monuments with old structures where as if you feel the life has come to a halt for some time, and then you have these new structures, new monuments, modern buildings, best of the 5-star hotels, so it immediately transforms you. And it's not a very big city, I must say. So it's just about you cross the river and you are transformed to an entirely different world. It is not about only monuments that Lucknow is famous for, but it's about its culture, craft, cuisine, and everything. It's a soft culture which still lives on, not for tourists, mind you. It is living by itself. It is thriving by itself. And all this is not happening for tourists. So it's not a kind of an airport art that's happening in Lucknow. So it comes in very naturally. Reaching Lucknow is not at all a problem now. You have multiple flights from Delhi and Bombay and Chennai. From Agra, it is only 3.5 hours of drive via Kannauj it could be. Kannauj is another great place for perfumes, traditional perfumeries. And then you have Cawnpore, which is 2 hours as an excursion, very good as an excursion. You have Allahabad, 4 hours, Varanasi, 6 is straight, but you can also do Varanasi via Allahabad. Plus, we are coming up with a new expressway from Lucknow to Varanasi, which will further reduce time to about 4 hours in next year or so. So that's another good news for you. But of course, till that time, you can always think of exploring Allahabad, another British loved city. So there are only very few cities in India which were thoroughly loved by British. Lucknow being one of them, Cawnpore, Allahabad. So in our area, these are the 3 cities that I can name that these were just loved by the British. Ayodhya is another place which was the birthplace of Lord Rama. So in case you are not intending to go to Varanasi for the religious sites, Ayodhya can be another unpretentious Hinduism, experience of Hinduism, the Ghats and the, a place where life actually stops. In terms of hotel, we have the finest in terms of hospitality, which is still the Taj. Now it's named as Taj Mahal and it qualifies to be the luxury hotel in Lucknow. First luxury hotel. I think it is unique because it has huge gardens. It is only a 3-story building, which is now rare. It has a huge lobby, which now usually hotels consider as waste of revenue to give such a huge lobby. So other hotels that have come up may just not have lobbies to them, or may just not have gardens, or they will never ever have the luxury of getting that space in the city which Taj has actually got. But we have all the top brands that are already there, and Lebua Lucknow is another small charming property, 40-room property, which can be looked at for FITs, but only their upper category rooms. Then you have Hyatt Regency, which is there, Renaissance by Marriott, Novotel, Clark Sawat is the old boy in Lucknow. So this way we have a lot of brands coming up, new properties that are coming up within a year. It's the 4 Points by Sheraton. There is Holiday Inn that's coming. So there's a lot of things that are happening in Lucknow, primarily not focused at foreign or Indian leisure travelers, primarily focused at business travelers, because we don't have those numbers to cater to. As I said, it's only 20,000. So 20,000 doesn't mean that all of them will stay at these luxurious hotels. So 20,000 includes all kinds of foreign tourists that come into Lucknow. But we have options, and Westerners are so carried away by the fact that they have visited a destination which is not touristy. So that makes them feel so good that they are visiting something which is not touristy otherwise. So now just a quick thing. I went through this presentation very quickly about Lucknow because we did a detailed presentation on Lucknow last time. So I just wanted to make it a bit different and give more time to our theme, which is Cawnpore for today. So we started out in 1994. We are small, and consciously we are small. So our area of work is either limited to the themes that we do, or it is to the destination. So we are not present in India. You are welcome to work with your DMCs with whom you are working at the moment, but the idea is that they should know about the different products that exist in the city. So these are few experiences. This is just a glimpse of those experiences that I have put together for this presentation. We are the company which introduced India's first walking tour in 1994. Probably this was the time when nobody knew about walking tours, and DMCs were just not selling or informing tour operators that they could be going into, some sort of small dingy lanes or some sort of traditional bazaars, or they were very, very restricted for their clients to visit places like just the monument and back to the hotel, have a 5-star kind of very, very pretentious food in the hotel, and they pack you off. So now that's all changed. So people want to experience new things, how locals live, So this is a short video about the Heritage Walk, what all they get to see, what all crafts that they get to see. This is just 1 kilometer walk in an old traditional bazaar. Mind you, all these walking tours are not done by normal general guides at our place. These are specialists who specialize in just, maybe if it's Heritage Walk, he would just be doing the Heritage Walk. So when it is walking with the walk leader, there's a lot of detailing. There are a lot of notes that you are giving. There are a lot of maps that you are shown. And you get the kind of a pulse that city is living. It's a kind of a living museum. 1 kilometer walk will introduce you to all that's bygone. The food walk, we have 2 food walks. One is the culinary walk, which is essentially non-vegetarian. The other is the Beyond Kebab walk, which is essentially vegetarian. And when I'm saying vegetarian, it is a strict Hindu meal without onion, without garlic. So that's the kind of city that I live in. So it has contrast, and both the cultures are so very well amalgamated and living together. So this walk takes you with an expert who is a foodie by passion, or he could be a chef by profession. He's leading this walk. He's introducing you to the recipes, the food history, the shop history, and everything. You are getting to taste things in unpretentious surroundings. We still have, by the way, about 100 existing varieties of kebabs, not necessarily sold at the shops, could be at home, but we still have 100 varieties of kebabs. And there were, we are told, many more which don't exist anymore. Then another interesting product could be a Victorian walk, which was designed and researched by Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones for us. And this takes you through an area which is, you can say, a modern area, but it details with the history which dates back to pre-1857, which is the pre-mutiny era, through today. So it's a very interesting marketplace with about 1 kilometer of walk again, and it ends at an afternoon tea. And by the way, this is the place where Cliff Richard was born, and he spent his life here. Not life, he went to Calcutta after that, but his early days, and then he would come back to Lucknow and play his, so people do remember him playing guitar at one of the places there. So we take you to his place, and not inside the home, but you are able to see the home of Cliff Richard where he was born. We have many other walking tours, of course, not going into detail, but yes, the first one in this list is Wajid Ali Shah Walk, which takes you through a destroyed palace complex, which was Kaisar Bagh. Kaisar Bagh, it is said, was one of the most beautiful palaces ever made. It was destroyed as a revenge by the British in 1858 or so, after the failed mutiny. But we try to reconstruct this beautiful palace complex through this walk and end it at a place which is Kotwara House, home of Muzaffar and Meera Ali, who are filmmakers. The guests get to see his home, watch a clip from a period film which is Umrao Jan, which he made, and which was based on Awadh, and have a tea. I thought I will just show you this old plaque which still exists in Kanpur. There were train bogies which still had this spelling, and as I opened, I said that a lot of history is dependent on the spelling. Just 2 hours drive from Lucknow. So you go in the morning, do the sights, and come back in the evening. So the sights are very touching. The story will make you cry. The incidents that happened in Kanpur. Lucknow had most number of deaths, but I think there was no other place in the mutiny of 1857 which was as dreadful, as inhuman, which happened in Kanpur. So if you're coming from Delhi, you can take a train called Shatabdi Express and get off at Kanpur. We pick you up, take you to a nice 5-star hotel there to use the lobby level facilities, have your lunch, do a tour of Kanpur with a specialist guide, of course. After that tour is done, have tea in Kanpur, or further up there's a bird sanctuary en route. You can come and have a loose stop there on Kanpur-Lucknow road, have a cup of tea and further move up to Lucknow. So this is how it works. Or if you're coming to Lucknow, you can have a easy 2 hours drive. When I say 2 hours, 2 hours from your hotel where you stay to the mutiny sites. So it's not city to city 2 hours drive. That could be about 1.5 hours of drive. But 2 hours from the hotel that you are staying to the hotel. First, if you are doing a tour, my suggestion would be to have Kanpur first and then bring them to Lucknow, so that the storyline so falls in place. But otherwise also, there are people who, for some logistic reasons, they want to be in Lucknow the first night or something, they can probably do that. Now, Kanpur is one place which was visited by Prince Edward, Prince of Wales, when he was Prince of Wales. Edward. Now, you can understand how important Kanpur would have been. Of course, Lucknow was visited by him first, and then after he came to Lucknow, when he came to Lucknow, he went to the residency. That was the time when there were a lot of war veterans who were alive. So you can see in this picture there are wounded soldiers as well who fought in the mutiny, and that's how he's meeting them at the residency. After residency, he went to La Martiniere, which very few know. So he visited La Martiniere estate, paid homage to Hodson there at his grave, and then the royal party continued to Kanpur. In Kanpur, he visited the memorial, the mutiny memorial, which Rosie will tell you about in detail in a while. Of course, Lucknow has had the privilege of having two Prince of Wales. One was, of course, Prince Albert Edward, Queen Victoria's eldest son. This was Edward VII. And then we had King George V, who visited Lucknow. He did not go to Kanpur, of course. But Kanpur has had the privilege of having one Prince of Wales, and we have had privilege of having two Prince of Wales. So that's all the more reason for you to get your guests to a place which is visited by two Prince of Wales. So now, as I said, the history changes. Kanpur was a laid-back religious city by the side of River Ganges. So there was nothing there, just a city of nothingness. Suddenly, British took over, made it their stronghold. They changed the spelling from Kanpur to Cawnpore. Later on, it continued. After the mutiny, it became a very, very important business city. Manchester of East, it was called. A lot of British mills came up. The Lal Imli, the Muir Mills, the Elgin Mills, and so many others. So that was the history of Cawnpore till India got independence, and again the spelling was changed to Kanpur. It remained a business city. It still is a business city. Most of the mills are closed now, but you can still see those old mill structures of Elgin Mill, of Muir Mill. So they still exist. So it's a fabulous thing. They also have a very old European cemetery, which is pre-1857. That's also a very interesting cemetery. So it doesn't have people from 1857 buried there, but before that, because there were a lot of Europeans who worked in Kanpur. This is a very old picture by a celebrated artist of those times, Sitaram. This is his picture of Kanpur, the main mall road. So every major city had this mall road, and Kanpur still has a mall road. So in Lucknow we don't call mall road as mall road anymore, but Kanpur they still call it as mall road. So you will still identify with old British history, the spellings and all those things is still in Kanpur. So Kanpur is kind of left out. In Lucknow they have tried to change a lot of spellings, names, etc. But Kanpur somehow Indians forgot. So that's in a way a nice thing to experience. May I now request Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones for her story on Cawnpore.
To be here, and also to congratulate Prateek Hira and Tornos on their 25th anniversary. I actually remember meeting Prateek way back when he was just about to start, and I have a kind of memory that we were dancing at La Martiniere, but I may be making this up. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to support Prateek and Tornos. And I have to tell you that apart from writing books, apart from being an academic historian, I'm also a tour guide, and I take tours to India, so I know what it's like from the sharp end. I used to work for Martin Randall when I did a number of tours in Bengal, going up the Hooghly. I'm now working for Indus Experiences, and we've got Yasin Zaga here. And the last tour I led was in October last year, when I said, why don't we just go to places that I know and I like and where I've got friends? And it was very successful indeed. We had about 10 people. We started off in Delhi. We went to Meerut. We then moved on to Lucknow, and we did take a day trip to Cawnpore, so I know the logistics of it. We finished up in Kolkata and did a boat trip to Serampore. And it was really good. People enjoyed it. Some of the people on the tour were actually looking for the graves of their ancestors. It wasn't promoted as specifically a cemetery tour, but the good thing is that at least 2 people on the tour found the graves of their ancestors, and they were very pleased about that. So what I'm going to do is to talk you briefly through the events of the mutiny as it affected Cawnpore. And Cawnpore, if it's known for anything at all today outside India, is probably known for the dreadful events of the mutiny. So this is what I'm going to talk about. You understand now its relationship to Lucknow. You understand how far away it is. It's about a 2-hour drive. And just to emphasise that it was always a British cantonment, that is a military base where the British were stationed there on one side of the river Ganges, and the fabulous kingdom of Awadh was on the other side. And it said the British established Cawnpore as a cantonment so they could keep an eye on what was happening in the kingdom of Awadh. Now, quite some time ago, a film was made in India called The Uprising, and it was about the mutiny. We normally call it the uprising now. Mutiny is quite an old-fashioned term, though funnily enough, you'll hear more people in India calling it the mutiny than you will here, because perhaps they're not so politically correct. It was a great film. This is Amir Khan in probably one of his best roles, and it was more sympathetic towards the British than I imagined it might have been. It told the story of Mangal Pandey, who is supposed to be the person who actually started the mutiny off in Barrackpore. Very, very good film indeed. So this is something you could perhaps show excerpts from. It's on YouTube. So if you're talking about a mutiny tour, have a little look at this. Now, the mutiny was the most dramatic and tragic event that happened in the whole of Britain's history and relationship with India. It changed everything. People simply couldn't believe, they'd become complacent, they couldn't believe that Indians would rise against what they perceived as benevolent British rule. It was a horrible shock, a huge loss of life. And it is something that still resonates today. Books are still being produced about the mutiny. So though it happened in 1857, it still resonates today. There is still a large number of memorials, there's still a large number of books, paintings, all kinds of things connected with the mutiny. So it's a seminal event, put it like that. And one of the reasons was that for the first time, Victorian Britain saw British women, British children, being killed by Indians, by savages, as they thought. And there are a large number of dramatic representations and paintings in Britain to show how horrible it was. This was more or less before the era of photography, so it could only be expressed by paintings. This was a particularly sad painting called In Memoriam, and it shows a group of British women and children with an Indian nurse awaiting death. Actually, they're going to be saved, because if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see that the Gordon Highlanders are just about to come in and save them. But it's a very, very dramatic event. And another one too, this is supposed to be the retreat from Lucknow. Once the residency had been relieved, as Prateek was saying, people walked out. Of course they didn't walk out like this. They were actually looking like scarecrows. They were starving, they were in rags. So again, it's a Victorian representation of what they imagined the mutiny to be about. And to some extent, we still see it through Victorian eyes. Obviously, a lot of Indian historians have written about it since, but the back of our mind, there's always something, seeing it as it was in 1857, seeing British women and children killed, massacred, desecrated. So again, this is something we have at the back of our minds. I'm not going to bore you with facts and figures, but this just gives you the outline of what happened. Started in 1857. It's all over by November of the following year. It's only in a localized area of North India. Nothing happened in Chennai. Very little happened in Bombay. So we're looking at that stretch of northern India. And considering the huge number of Indian citizens who were killed, in a way the British got off quite lightly, but it's that 1,000 to 1,500 European civilians killed which resonated in Victorian India, which is why it became such an important point. And of course it had repercussions. The East India Company, who'd been in charge of parts of India since almost 1600, was abolished. Queen Victoria issued a proclamation saying that's the end, they have behaved disgustingly. They were a multinational corporation, and in the end most multinational corporations will have a finite point, and this was the finite point for the East India Company. India was taken over by direct rule by the British government, and India became independent in 1947. So that's the history. And I won't go into the causes because I've written about these quite extensively. You might ask why Indians suddenly rose up against the British. In fact, there have been a whole series of mutinies before. The reason this one is so important is that though it started off among soldiers And when soldiers revolt against their officers and start killing their officers, the technical term is a mutiny. But it then involved the civil population as well, all kinds of petty landlords, nobles, some rajas, some maharajas joined against the British. So starting off as a military mutiny, it becomes a huge civil uprising. And those are some of the reasons. Now, moving on to Cawnpore, one of the sites that you will see, and you do actually need special permission to have a look at some of these areas because the Indian Army has taken over parts of it. This is Wheeler's entrenchment. It no longer exists, but what we can see on the ground are the markers where the buildings were, and they were two wretched buildings. One was a hospital building, the other one was a new barracks, and it's called Wheeler's entrenchment after General Wheeler, who was in Cawnpore, and when he realised that revolt was starting, that the Indian soldiers were starting to mutiny, he decided to gather all the British civilians together in this rather unsatisfactory site. There are all kinds of rights and wrongs about who was leading the rebellion in Cawnpore. But what actually happened was that for 3 weeks during the boiling summer, June and July 1857, there were about 1,000 British civilians in these wretched buildings. They couldn't defend themselves. The earth was so hard they couldn't actually build any kind of defensive ditch or barricade. They were shot at by cannons, fired at by bullets. This is what it looked like after the entrenchment was deserted. So Wheeler's entrenchment, it's one of the most important places. You can Google it and it will come up with details. As I say, part of it is now taken over by the Indian Army, so you have to get special permission to visit the area, which is obviously something that is arranged by Tornos. So Wheeler's entrenchment. Wheeler himself was subsequently killed. What happened basically was that after 3 weeks of absolute hell holed up in Wheeler's entrenchment was that the ruler of Cawnpore, the Nana Sahib, sent a note saying, if you surrender, I will make sure you are saved. What we'll do is to take you to the banks of the Ganges and we'll send you downriver to Allahabad, which is in British hands. So basically, if you say you surrender, we'll accept your surrender and we'll see you're all right. And that was the theory. This is known as Satichora Ghat. It's on the banks of the Ganges, and I have to say, I saw it last year. It's almost unchanged. It seems extraordinary that it's still recognisable today from these photographs. So the British, coming out of the entrenchment, half-starved, many of them seriously ill, are marched down to the river where they think they're going to be saved. They think there are going to be boats there to take them down to safety. This is what actually happened. There were boats there, and the men were embarked on the boats, the women and children left on the banks, and all of a sudden cannons started from the shore. The boats were bombarded. Some of them were covered with thatch. That's fairly common. You put a sort of roof of thatch on the top of the boat, and they started firing flaming arrows at the thatch. So if you weren't actually shot, you were likely to be burnt to death. And from this awful massacre, only 4 men survived. 1 Anglo-Indian boy and 3 British men survived. They managed to float downriver. So this was an absolutely frightful massacre, but worse was to follow. The Bibigar, the House of the Ladies. This is a name which in English history resonates as much as Jallianwala Bagh does in Indian history. It has the same impact, the Bibigar. It's something that makes us shiver. The rest of the women and children, seeing their menfolk dead, killed on the shores of the Ganges, were marched back to a house which had originally housed some of the mistresses of a nobleman. Bibi is a mistress, sometimes a wife, but more often a mistress. Gur simply means house, so it's the house of the mistresses, or the house of the women. And it was here that about 230 women and children were massacred. And the Nanasar, who was supposed to have been responsible for the massacre, actually got in butchers from the town, men who were used to cutting up animals, and set them loose on the women. Even the next morning, a few had survived under the bodies of those who had been killed. The whole place was covered with bloody handprints, locks of hair that had been torn out. Not surprisingly, the Bibigar was demolished by the British once they recaptured Cawnpore. It was a place of such horror, it couldn't be allowed to stand. This is the only photograph we have of it. And these are the men who marched into Cawnpore 24 hours too late to save the women and children. These are the Highlanders, and quite frankly, if I met someone like that, I would be pretty scared too. So not surprisingly, Cawnpore was evacuated. It was too late to save the women and children. Their bodies were thrown down a well, the infamous well of Cawnpore. They were stripped of their clothes, so it was when the British came and looked over the edge of the well, there were naked bodies there. Two little English boys trying to escape the butchers were reported as running around the outside of the well, and they were struck down too, though some people claim to have seen the ghosts of little British boys running up and down the area. Not surprisingly, the British had a frightful revenge. They strung up anybody they could find, guilty or not. And why I started this short talk with the slogan, "Remember Cawnpore," this is what the British soldiers shouted as they went through to Lucknow. Don't ever forget Cawnpore, don't ever forget the frightful massacre there. A church of remembrance was built. This is All Souls Church. It's here being built. And again, this is something you actually need to get permission to enter. There's a rather crusty old priest there who has to be bribed with cigarettes. I think I'm right, aren't I? you have to bribe him. But it's well worth going inside, because inside are the names of all of the dead on marble plaques inside. It's well worth going into. It's a notable building, All Souls Church. And the angel that Prateek mentioned, this is the angel of the redemption. It was sculpted by the Italian sculptor Marchetti, and this was at the suggestion of Lady Canning, who was the wife of the Viceroy during the mutiny. It's a beautiful piece of work, and it did originally stand over the dreaded well itself. But in 1947, the newly dependent Indian authorities were worried that it might be damaged in some kind of independence celebration, so very sensibly they had it moved to the grounds of All Souls Church. So when you go to the church, you can go and see the Angel of Redemption too. And as Prateek said, one of my interests is in cemeteries in India. And although this looks a bit of a muddled picture, the reason it's interesting is that the man sitting on the steps is Mark Probert. He's a New Zealander, and his great-great-great-grandmother, Ellen Probert, was one of the women who was killed and her body thrust down the well. Also 6 children. Mark is descended from the 7th, who was not in Cawnpore at the time. And he goes back at least once a year. And I said, what's all that stuff there? And he said, well, we wanted a little kind of Buddhist Hindu feast, if you like, a kind of memorial feast for my ancestor and her children. And what he's actually doing is explaining to somebody from Cawnpore who just drifted up and said, what are you doing? And Mark told them, he said, my ancestors are here, my ancestors are down the well. And the man said, I didn't know anything about this, I'm very sorry. But the reason I'm showing this is that there is still living links between what happened during the mutiny and people today. They might have dispersed to New Zealand, a lot are still in England, but it's a vital and important thread. I can't emphasize this enough, that a huge number of people had relatives who were caught up in the mutiny or suffered some of the trauma from friends who died during the mutiny. It's living history for us. And the last picture, which is going to lead us into Lucknow, and Mark talking about the march to Lucknow. This is a photograph on the Cawnpore Road, the old road that linked the two cities. Obviously, it's after the siege of Lucknow, ruined buildings, but what is really interesting is the telegraph post. And this was something the British needed to establish almost immediately. They'd taken back control. The telegraph posts were cut down during the mutiny, not surprisingly, because they could convey information. So one of the first things the British do when they regain control is to put up the telegraph poles and wires again. And you can see even in the left-hand side there's a discarded cannon there. This is what it was like. And I'm now going to pass over to Mark, who's going to tell you about his ancestors' march from Cawnpore to Lucknow. Thank you.
Looking forward to having some supper. I don't want to hear for too long from me. But can I add my congratulations to those of Rosie, to Prateek on the 25 years of Tornos. I first met Prateek, I think, about 12 years ago in Lucknow on a tour which Rosie was leading. And we were besieged, not in the residency, but we were besieged in Lucknow. That's one of the aspects of visiting Lucknow which Prateek did not mention. But actually, if you're lucky nowadays, you won't be besieged like we were. And making it even more extraordinary, we were accompanied on that occasion by a chap called Henry Lawrence, who is the great-great-grandson of Sir Henry Lawrence, who was the resident in Lucknow at the time of the mutiny, and I'll tell you a little bit about him in a moment. And his comment to the press at the time was, "It seems a misfortune in my family always to be besieged in Lucknow." At any rate, I'm just going to say a little bit about my great-great-grandfather, General Havelock, because it does actually tie in something which is still very British with the history of Lucknow, and in particular the mutiny. Now, I don't know how many of you here recognise that, or does anyone know where it is? Well, 18 years ago, I think it is now, when he was Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone suddenly announced that it was time Trafalgar Square was redesigned. And he said, "Who are these fusty old generals?" Everyone, of course, knows about Nelson or Nelson's column, but what about all the others and the generals on either side, and who's ever heard of them? And the one on the right of Nelson's column, as you look at the National Gallery, is General Havelock. He stands between Nelson's column and South Africa House, and the general on the other side is General Charles Napier, who was credited with the conquest of the Punjab a little bit earlier than the mutiny period. I, at the time, I have to say, thought that rather demonstrated Ken Livingstone's ignorance of history. But in fact, we don't now much talk in this country about the history of what is called the mutiny, or what we prefer to call the uprising, because, as Rosie says, we're rather politically correct and slightly embarrassed about it all. But the fact is, it happened, and as Rosie says, it was a seminal event which absolutely gripped Victorian England. It was the first really serious challenge anywhere within the growing British Empire of challenge to British rule. And indeed, it was on a knife edge for a few weeks when the British might have lost control of their empire in India altogether. And the two key points in the mutiny were, first of all, Delhi, which is not for this evening, but there was the siege of Delhi, and the other was, of course, the relief of Cawnpore, and then later Lucknow. Very briefly, if you haven't been to a Havelock pub, or you don't live in a town where there's Havelock Street, Havelock Square, Havelock Terrace, although I suspect quite a few of you do or didn't realise you did, they're all named after him. And it's hard to realise now that in mid-19th century Victorian England, General Havelock was, after 1857, probably the most famous military figure after the Duke of Wellington and Nelson. He was a very, very major figure indeed. In fact, he was an internationally known figure, all because of what happened in the relief of Lucknow. And I won't take you through all of this in detail, because it's just a very brief canter through it. But he had served in India for most of his life. As you can see there, he started off as a very young ensign, joining the Rifle Brigade just after Waterloo, and it took him over 40 years to get to the rank of colonel. Now that's longer than anyone would normally serve in the armed forces, even as a regular soldier, for the whole of their career. But it took him that long to get to the very top. But he was very highly regarded. He wasn't a blimp, although it's fair to say he was a bit of a Bible-thumping Christian. But he wasn't a blimp. He was an expert in Persian. He was, from quite an early age, an interpreter. He understood a great deal about Indian culture, and as you can see, he spent most of his life in India. And he finally started to get towards the top when he was in his mid-60s, long after the age when nowadays you would have been retired out of the army. And he reached the rank of Adjutant General, it's just out of the picture there, in 1855, and his first senior command campaign was when we had a little war with Persia early in 1857. So he went off to Persia in command of one division of the army there. No sooner had he arrived than in fact a peace treaty was signed, so he saw very little action, somewhat to his dismay, and thought he'd come back for a quiet retirement for another 2 or 3 years service in India. But it was not to be, because the mutiny broke out in May of that year, just as he was returning home, and he was immediately summoned to Calcutta to see the Governor-General, because it was suggested that he would be the ideal man to lead a small relief force to rescue those who were already under siege in Cawnpore and those who were threatened with siege in Lucknow. And you've seen this map already in Prateek's presentation, or a map very like it, but he actually started from Allahabad, where he gathered his small force together. Any idea that this was a great big army that was marching to victory across the Indian plain you can dispel. I think in total he had at the start about 1,800 men, and it was a mixture of some Highlanders, some Sikh cavalry, something which sometimes gets overlooked, but in all of this history, politics is complicated, isn't it? All the Sikh troops remained stoutly loyal to the British, and a bit of artillery and some infantry. And he set off from Allahabad in this direction towards Cawnpore there. On the way, he fought no less than 9 battles, pitched battles with against vastly superior mutiny forces, but not, of course, as well commanded. So he might, on occasion, and this is well recorded, be facing between 10 and 20,000 rebel forces with his very small band, and he defeated them in every single one of these engagements, and eventually reached Cawnpore 24 hours too late. One of the great tragedies of the mutiny was that he was just too late. Something that Rosie might have mentioned is that actually Lady Wheeler, Sir Hugh Wheeler's wife, I think I'm right in saying, was related to Nana Sahib through her mother. So she was Anglo-Indian. And there's some suggestion that Sir Hugh Wheeler, who was commanding in Cawnpore, thought that if the worst came to the worst, the one thing the Nana Sahib would not do is to attack, in effect, someone married to a member of his family, and therefore that the British to that extent would be safe. If they were going to be allowed to leave, they'd be allowed to leave quietly. We now know that didn't happen. And so Havelock gets there only to find the bodies in the well and the massacre has taken place. He then marches on up this way towards Lucknow, fighting again all the way through. One of the things that caused the greatest depredation to his fighting force was disease. Even the slightest wound was likely to go septic in those conditions. If you think about it, they're wearing thick serge uniforms. You've seen the photograph of the Highlanders. I mean, the rest of the infantry were wearing trousers. But that was just as hot. Temperatures must have been at 40 degrees or so in the middle of the Indian summer in the plain there. And so not only was disease rife, and he lost a lot of men that way, or if they didn't die, they were debilitated and of no fighting use anymore, and anyone who had even the slightest wound was a real risk that would prove eventually to be fatal. Now, what had happened in Lucknow, very briefly, is that the siege had really started in the end of June. Sir Henry Lawrence, who was the resident there, realised that the country all around was rising up. He knew that the native troops who were under his command there could no longer be relied upon, or most of them couldn't. And so he gathered all the Europeans, mainly British, but there were some other nationalities too, into the residency compound, that sort of small walled city that Prateek described earlier, for safety. And that was rather better to defend, although still imperfect, but better to defend than the entrenchment in Cawnpore, because it did actually have a wall and a compound which contained it. And there you see the numbers. And Henry Lawrence then ordered the arsenal, which was just outside where the residency was, to be blown up so that the mutineers didn't get hold of all the gunpowder there and the weaponry. And on the 1st of July, the siege really began as the mutineers closed in from all around the city and the countryside on the residency. And tragically, on the 2nd of July, he himself was killed. A cannonball came through the room in the residency where he was sitting. It burst and he was mortally wounded by a piece of shrapnel, and he died, I think, a couple of days later. And that was a bit of a disaster because he was a very considerable man. The Lawrence brothers, Henry, and then his brother John, who was the second viceroy after the mutiny was over, were both considerable India hands, if I can put it that way. They worked both militarily and politically in India for many years before. They knew a great deal about India and were also quite admired. And he was a real leader, and unfortunately, when he died, that left number 2 and number 3 in charge of the residency. But they had to then endure a siege, being attacked in particular on 3 occasions very fiercely indeed, until the 28th of September, when my great-great-grandfather's small force got there. By then he was down to less than, I think, 1,000 fighting men. So when he arrived, he was able to battle his way through the outskirts of the city and through the narrow streets of the city to the residency and to get in, but he didn't have enough troops, together with those who were surviving within the residency, who were now already part starved, to be able to evacuate and get out safely. So having arrived and at least improved the situation by bringing more men with him, he himself then got besieged in the residency because there wasn't sufficient manpower for them to get out. Interestingly, they were fairly short of food, but one of the things the residency did have was an enormous wine cellar, and the last thing you could think you would want in this incredible heat and with all the deprivation that there was in the residency is a glass of champagne, but it was the one thing that was available in huge quantities. Really what you wanted was some fresh water. So there was a lot of disease, apart from the fact that every day they were shelled and there was sniper fire and people were wounded and killed. There was also a lot of the civilians went down with cholera, typhus, smallpox and dysentery. What then happens is that another relief force, a slightly larger force, is gathered together, more time to organise in Calcutta, and a man called Sir Colin Campbell, who was very distinguished from the Crimean War, the Thin Red Line. I don't know if any of you remember about that, if you're interested in again in Victorian military history, the Battle of Balaclava and the Highlanders there. Colin Campbell was a very distinguished general. He came out to India as soon as the mutiny broke out, and he was put in command of a further, much rather larger relief force, and eventually broke through again to the residency in Lucknow in the third week of November. And this is a picture of a very famous painting which hangs in the National Portrait Gallery, and there are also a lot of prints around that you may have seen one in the past taken from it. It's a huge painting, and in fact each of the individuals in it is named. There is a key to this. It was meant to tell you who everyone is, but there is Colin Campbell greeting my great-great-grandfather and General Outram, who was with my great-great-grandfather on the first relief. It's of course a stylized picture. It wasn't like that at all. They in fact met under a hail of fire by running through various buildings protected by an armed guard to shake hands before the two forces then joined up. And Campbell did have enough men to be able to evacuate the residency and take all the civilians out of the city altogether. And what they left behind was the residency shattered. This is the main administrative building. It's an engraving done by a young officer at about the time of the end of the mutiny. That was the flagstaff which stood on the main tower, and one of the symbols of British India was always felt to be the Union Jack flying on the flag tower of the residency in Lucknow. And in fact, on independence, I think Prateek will correct me if I'm wrong, but on independence, one of the last things at midnight, and when British rule came to an end, was the lowering of the Union Jack over the residency in Lucknow. And although it wasn't the original flag, the flag then flying was taken back to London and is now on display at Windsor Castle. Here are some photographs of nearer the time. That's the Bailey Guard Gate, which was the main entrance gate to the residency, and that's what it looked like very shortly after the mutiny ended, bashed to bits. Astonishingly, that gateway still stands, and if you go to Lucknow, one of the most atmospheric aspects, in fact, for certainly anyone English who's interested in this history, or has a family member who's connected with these events, is if you go to Lucknow, the residency compound is still there. There's the graveyard where Henry Lawrence's very simple gravestone is to be found and where he's buried. The residency building, this is a photograph of it a little bit later, but I'm pretty certain this is nevertheless a mid-Victorian photograph, is standing there. There's the flagpoles, probably someone put up a new one after the events of the mutiny, but there is now a small museum in the basement where there is a large-scale model of what the residency and its surround looked like then, because there were a lot of narrow streets and buildings which aren't there anymore, which surrounded it. And some very attractive gardens, and until I think recently they used to do a sort of soirée lumière performance there.
Not presently.
Well, they did at one point at any rate, and it is really quite a moving and atmospheric place to see. Dr. Farrar's house, which effectively was the hospital, the Treasury building, they're all there pockmarked with the bullet holes and the cannonball holes from the time of the mutiny. Now, one might have thought that this was my great-great-grandfather's hour of triumph, and in one sense, of course, it was after he was 67 years of age, and finally he'd actually done something which not just the whole of the British nation, but actually the whole of the Western world as then learned about. He was so well known that when he had died, all the flags were flown at half-mast in New York and Boston Harbor, so the Americans took this to their heart as well. It was portrayed as a sort of battle of the brave Christian imperialists against what was thought to be really a sort of barbaric horde. It's pretty embarrassing to think of it in those terms now, because of course that wasn't the picture at all. And one of the tragedies of the mutiny, being a seminal event, is that, as Rosie said, it really changed the whole relationship between the British and India up until 1857. There had been really quite a lot of cultural and social interchange, and up until the 1830s and 40s, a lot of intermarriage between the British in India and native people in India, and have produced a wholly different culture. Once this happened, the trust was shattered. The British were very concerned that this should ever happen again, and so there became more of a segregation, and it became very much more of an imperial project rather than a project that was really engendered by trade and cultural exchange up until the 1850s. But at any rate, he didn't survive, because as they left the residency under Sir Colin Campbell, he got dysentery badly. There was no cure for that sort of thing then, and he was much weakened, at any rate, by his experiences both on the original campaign and then after he'd been besieged. And he died at a place called Allenbach, which in those days was a nice area surrounded by fields and open ground near an outpost which was called the Telegraph House, which was a military outpost on the outskirts of the town. There is now a metro station at Allenbach. It is now a busy suburb of Lucknow, for those of you who don't know it. And the grave, which to begin with was left unmarked, but they just very carefully took a survey of where it was, lest it should be desecrated, is now in the middle of a suburb. That's actually where he is buried, and later on in the early 1860s the family put up this monument. And I suppose the first time I went to Lucknow was when I got news through people who Rosie knew there that there was a property developer who was interested in acquiring all of this land here and building a new housing estate. And although this is a national protected monument, which it was, of course, under British rule, but then was inherited by the Archaeological Survey of India as being one of India's national protected monuments, that wasn't going to stop him knocking it down if no one was looking and building something. So I first went out to Lucknow in the mid-1990s to create merry health and make sure that it actually wasn't knocked down. Alternatively, I made the offer that I would happily have it demolished piece by piece, have him disinterred and bring him back to England if they didn't want him there. That caused outrage. Ironically, the idea that that should happen was thought to be most shocking, and as a result all these signs went up, brand new railings, new garden, and there's a chowkidar at the entrance, and you can go and see it. And now there's the metro station. It's a bit easier to get to than it used to be. And so that is the history. But if you do go to a Havelock pub, or you see there's a Havelock Road or a Havelock Terrace, that's why he was at the time so famous that all sorts of places were named after him here, and that's why he ended up in 1861 being put on a plinth in Trafalgar Square, and long may he stay there.
Dinner is served, but before that, may I request, there are six books to be given, and I'm not going to do this. I will just request. We'll start with you. If you could give it a big.
Oh,
Just take out, make sure that don't take out yours.
how many do you want me to put out?
One. He's one.
I'm pulling out that one.
Okay. Can we have Prateek?
Yeah.
Mamta Suresh? There you go. I'm sure you put two. You did say to me, can I put two? So if you could just have. So there's one down.
Okay.
One out. To take out. आपने अपना कार्ड भी डाला है? नहीं. मुझसे में क्या आता है, you know?
Yellow one.
The yellow one.
Oh,
Which is again
Same
very good.
China. It's the
There's
same.
something going
There's
on
something
there.
about the color of the cards, isn't it? Okay, now don't see anybody. Please close your eyes and take out the next one. Okay, go on. Close your eyes.
reading them. You
Because the color's attractive, isn't it? There we go. Sanjay. There you go. Okay. I should get one.
Sanjay, that was rigged, huh?
Sorry. So we've got three more to go. I'm just looking. Somebody who closes their eyes. You take that one. I'm sure you're not going to pick up your own.
She's got like 10,000 there. No.
This one. There you go.
Okay, so that's Vivek.
Oh.
There you go.
Obviously rigged. Sanjay and Vivek.
Sanjay and Vivek. So they've all done it for
Is
how many?
that's
We've
right.
got 3 more to go, do we? You take out one.
Which one of the 6 is going to do the reading from the book?
Yeah.
Somebody's got to do a reading.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, you were there.
That definitely reeks of something right here. And the last one, you were saying something, so let me ask you to take out one.
I'm definitely not going to take out my own because
Do you know the
I
cover?
want somebody else to do the reading.
Toby. So,
There you go.
super Milga, you can share. She should do the reading, give you a chapter to read and the other chapter. So dinner is served, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you all, and let's have a drink and carry on for dinner. Thank you
for
once
coming.
again. Hope to see all of you next
We are
week.
meeting.
Sorry, hope to see most of you or all of you in Lucknow in August. Is that correct?
Yes, you have an open invitation to be a part of this UP Travel March, which opens on 9th, 10th and 11th. So if you are really willing to be in Lucknow, we can organize the tickets for you and of course the hospitality.
Thank you.
Thank you. We must catch up and we
So you narrate it as well, or you just shoot it?